Welcome to the Archive Room podcast.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Fastamai, I'm Judith Lay, and I'm very pleased to find you waiting for me at the door to the Archive Room, the place where we keep stories of island life in years gone by, told by the people who were there. So come on in, sit down and make yourself comfortable, and let's listen to this week's selection. This week, Terry Cringle and David Callister are treating themselves to a bag of popcorn and seats in the circle when they go for an evening at the cinema. And there's another episode of our serial, The Little Dark Cupboard, where it's all getting a bit complicated. The brandy is out again, but who is Eva giving it to? You can find out later in the programme. But first, let's head to the south to meet yet another fascinating character with some great stories to tell. Stanley James Madrill Karran, described as a consummate Manxman, was born in 1910, and this conversation with David Callister was recorded when Stanley was 90 years of age, and they're in Stanley's house at Cregneash on the road leading down to the Sound. David began by asking Stanley for his earliest memories.
Well, I was born in this house, lived in it until the outbreak of the Second World War. And then I went to the war, came home and I got married. And after my wife died, I came back up here to live with a widowed sister who was younger than me. And unfortunately she died and now I'm left on my own. And unfortunately got no family. So here I am, up in the wilds up here all on my own. Life in general was very hard up here in my young days.
Yeah.
My earliest memories was actually before the First World War. The memories I've got of the start of the First World War was seeing the horse-drawn drays coming up here with sections of huts on them to go out to the big mountain out there. A lot of stupid people call it Spanish Head, but there's no such place as Spanish Head. There were 2 army huts put out there to guard what was already there, and what was already there was a Coast Guard station. I think it was erected by Lloyd's, and that was great interest to us in our young days. Cousins, older than me, of course, and they learnt the semaphore and they could read.
Yes.
See, that was very interesting.
That wouldn't affect life down here, that First World War, would it?
No, and of course my father was sailing, and my mother was very worried about that, you see. That was in the First World War. At that time, too, if my mother wanted to go to meet relatives or friends out in Serbia or up out at the level, she'd always have me for company. Before I was 6 years of age, you know.
How did you get to the places?
Walked it. There was no transport up here then, and people used to say about having the shopping came to the door. There was a baker's cart up here practically every day of the week, and the grocers about 3 times a week. And the grocer all came in with his book, what do you want today, and took his list and went and got it out of the cart.
Yes.
And that was the shopping. Except for the butchers, they had to go down for meat, Portsmouth chiefly for that. Now that's all disappeared now. The motor cars made the difference, you see.
Do you remember the first motor car appearing up here?
I remember them with the gas bags on top.
Gas bags?
Yeah, they ran them off town gas. 1 or 2 gentlemen came to retire to the Portsmouth Mary, and they had the old cars there and the brake lever and all that outside the door.
That's right.
I remember all that.
And you say there's no Spanish Head, you say?
No. Spanish Head is a misnomer. No such place. On the Isle of Man. George Broderick, I think it was telling me there's at least 3 Spanish Heads out in Ireland, which are genuine Spanish Heads.
Why did you get the name Spanish Head down here?
Well, if you get Manx Dictionary and look up the word Spenia, S-P-E-E-N-E-Y, that means peeling, anything that's peeling. Well, the lintel quarry out there was an important place in his day. All the cottages had their big lintel over the chollach.
Yes.
And the window lintels, for instance, turnip sheds, they had the big lintels crossed, and they were important.
And the lintel farmers lived here, did they?
My grandfather was the last to do it commercially.
Was he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it stopped one day, suddenly. Now, the point is, you're getting at Spenia, that means peeling. And these lintels used to peel off. Yeah. That's how they got them. They couldn't blast them.
No.
They'd fracture the lintel. And they came fairly easy. But if you look at the next word, you'll see S-P-E-A-N-E-Y, that means anything appertaining to Spain. Now, when the clever lad came over to write on the place names round the coast here, quite a while ago now, he'd asked one of the old chaps that was taking him round, well, what do you call this place here? I mean, this is after you'd passed Blackhead and Slagebury. Next place you'd come to was this lintel quarry. Oh, the old Manxman would say, oh, this is Ciona Spania. You couldn't distinguish whether the Manxman would say Spania or Spania.
No.
They didn't emphasise the words so much. He said, that solves it. This is where Spanish Armada was wrecked. See? And they put that on the maps. And it's all wrong. No, there wasn't a Spanish ship came down this channel off the Armada. They all went round the west coast of Ireland, down the Western Islands.
You just said a minute ago then that the slate quarrying stopped all of a sudden.
Yes. Well, my father took me out to show me one day where it was, right on the edge of the cliff. You're on the cliff here, take a step forward and you're down a couple of 100 feet. And he showed me a section there that was cleaned out, all the earth be chucked over the side, ready to start work the next morning. The next morning when he went out, well, the first thing he noticed, his tools was gone. And there must have been a slide of perhaps hundreds of tons of rock gone. Yeah. He might have been working on that the day before. He never went out again.
Give it up.
Give it up. So that was the end of the lintel quarrying out on the big mountain.
It must have been a very dangerous job anyway.
Absolutely, it was, because they'd be peeling them off and then they'd have to go down on ropes and haul them up.
Haul them up with a rope?
Yes.
Stanley Karran talking with David Callister in his house at Cregneash on the road leading down to the Sound. And I think anyone who's visited the chasms can well understand how incredibly dangerous it was to carry out lintel mining, peeling off the stone from such unstable rocks. We'll be hearing some more very different stories from Stanley Karran later in the programme. But now it's a night off for David Callister and Terry Cringle, and they're heading off to the cinema.
It's quite warm in here tonight, Terry. It's not bad, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Do you want
popcorn?
Yes, please.
Oh, yes, please. Right,
fairly warm.
Yeah, no, not bad, eh? Not bad.
Right.
1 and 9 we paid to get in here, was it?
Yeah,
1 and 9.
Not bad. Getting a bit expensive now, isn't
Let's
it?
see if we've got any change to get.
Yeah, I know. We've got to get the chips afterwards, haven't we?
Oh, I've got a couple of tanners there. Well, just a bag of chips each?
Yeah, up to makings.
Yeah.
Okay. No drinking the vinegar out of the bag now again.
Oh, look, here's his organ. Organ's coming up. Wow. Here we go.
George Tootle, then?
George, yeah. Lovely lights.
Yeah.
Well, we can settle down and watch the trailers in a few minutes, I suppose. There'll be a few ads, won't there?
And the newsreel.
And good features. A good hour coming on, I believe. A very good show.
Oh, absolutely. Rocking in the aisles, this will.
Today we've been elevated to a seat in the circle. Well, what we're really here for, of course, is to hear from some of the people who were involved in cinema management in the Isle of Man. I spoke to 2 of the former cinema managers with the company who owned all the cinemas, virtually all the cinemas in the Isle of Man, the Palace and Derby Castle Company. I spoke to one of the chaps who really wasn't a cinema manager at all. He sort of did a bit of it in his spare time. He was dealing with other sections of the Palace Company's business, the Palace Ballroom. But Laurie Kissack, from time to time, was brought in to look after cinemas when they needed somebody to relieve the other managers. On the other hand, Charles Draper, in May 1946, became the manager of the Strand Cinema in Douglas.
I used to work as manager of the Strand Cinema during the summer season, and then in the winter we all moved around because the bigger buildings used to be closed, such as the Royalty and the Crescent cinemas were closed. I then went doing the holiday reliefs at all the cinemas that the Palace Company possessed.
So you've been in all of them? In fact.
Yes, Strand Cinema, Port Erin, the Pavilion at Peel, and the Avenue Onken, all the Douglas cinemas.
Were you a film fan yourself then?
Not really. Very rarely did I ever see a film right through, but on occasions I used to pick out odd bits of the film that I enjoyed, such as the No Limit film. The funniest bits, I used to love going into the hall to hear the shrieks of laughter at appropriate points, you know.
Well, Laurie Kissack, I remember seeing you at the Royalty.
I was only doing relief work then. I started with the company in 1935, and I was in the office, and in the summertime I worked at the Palace taking tickets. When I came back after the war, I was assistant manager at the Palace with George Farragut. I was assistant from 46 up to 1957 and manager from 58 up to 65.
I've seen both of you fellas standing out there in your monkey suits many a time, and you had to wear these dinner suits then, did you? I mean, that was law in the Palace Company, was it?
Yeah.
Yes.
I remember Jim Killip used to come down wearing his dinner jacket with his cycling clips on his bike.
That's right.
Well, I did one night at the Regal Cinema without socks on. It was pointed out to me by one of the usherettes in the circle.
Well, how did you manage the queues? Because there must have been colossal queues in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, yes, they were. From the Strand Cinema point of view, we weren't allowed to queue in Strand Street because otherwise it prevented shoppers from looking into the shop windows. So we used to have to queue in Howard Street opposite, and the doorman used to stand over there, and I used to send the people across to him, and they queued down Howard Street and then along the promenade, and on some occasions round the next street where the butcher's is on the corner of Strand Street, you know.
Yes.
And I could see the end of the queue forming at the end of Strand Street.
What, they were queuing even in wet weather as well,
yes.
was it?
Yes, I remember one night I was doing one night relief. It was a Saturday night. It was pouring rain. The first house was full, but at the Strand you could push everybody out through into Market Street, through the back, you see.
Yes.
So I filled 2 waiting rooms with maybe 100 people in each.
Yes.
And I decided to bring some people in on the staircase, standing 2 together, you see. And that was about 7:45, with the show finishing at 8 o'clock. And everybody was just hinky-dory. And the building inspector walked in, and he had me.
Well, he'd be like the fire officer
So I was
today.
reported.
Oh, you reported, were you?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
On the carpet next day, was it?
Well, a mile carpet.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But the people who I let in out of the rain were very pleased that I'd done so.
Yes. Well, you must have met some of the film stars over the years. I know, Charles, that Anna Neagle came to the island.
It was due to Billy Hughes, in charge of all the cinema side. He was friendly with Herbert Wilcox, who was Anna Neagle's husband, and produced the films. And it was due to their friendship that they used to show their films first as a world premiere in the Isle of Man.
Some of the biggest cheers that went up in the cinema were when the projectionist had trouble with his reels.
Yes.
I mean, it didn't happen all that often. It did happen, didn't it, really?
Yeah.
It happened to me one night at the Avenue when a young man named Rowley was in charge. And we had a breakdown. I walked into the operating box and there was a massive film all over the floor. So I just had to cancel the evening and give people their money back.
Yes. Being a cinema manager, though, I mean, it wasn't really a glamorous job, was it, I'm sure?
Not really, no. We used to go through all the seats after the show. The object of it really was to see that there were no cigarette butts burning there.
Oh, you had
But
to check
of
that
course,
before you went home?
Yes.
Yeah.
The operator used to do the circle and I used to do the ground floor.
Yeah.
As well as looking for the cigarette butts, we also looked for lost property. And on one occasion I remember seeing what looked like a bag of sweets, and I picked this up and looked in it, and there was a piece of toffee with a full set of noshes stuck in it, and they were never claimed.
Charles Draper and Laurie Kissack, two former cinema managers there, with some of their recollections of their days in the Strand and
I was wondering what he was
places.
going to say was between that set of gnashes.
Enjoying their vintage night at the cinema, David Callister and Terry Cringle, and some cinema managers sharing their memories of the heyday of the picture houses. And now it's back to Cregneash, on the road to the Sound, and Stanley Karran, and he's got some more stories of life in the early 1900s. There were farms in the Karran family, but that wasn't the way of life that Stanley chose for himself.
You weren't a farmer, were you?
No, I wasn't a farmer.
Oh.
I worked a lot for my uncle and worked a lot for my sister down there, you know,
Yes.
when I was young. And the difference was, in those days when I was a young man, Saturday, I've seen me many a day down in my uncle's turnip shed, and we'd be cutting up the turnips, putting them in the chip baskets and stacking them up, ready for Sunday, so that he wouldn't have that much work to do. And Sunday came along here, all was quiet. It was a day of rest.
And was the church always used?
Oh yes, church has been used continuously from 1878.
Yes.
And you see, they were crafty. The church people, when they wanted a church, there must have been talk about a school, and they approached the Education Authority, and between them they built the school and the church. Now the church, it was only the sanctuary at the East End that was consecrated, and the rest was school through the week.
Yes.
And then the services on Sunday. And I remember a service of a Thursday night in the wintertime there.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So you'd go to Sunday school here, would you?
Oh yes, we were ecumenical up here. We'd go to the church in the afternoon, service here, and down to the Methodist down the How at night. We went to both Sunday schools, believe it or not.
Really? Yeah.
And the schoolmaster couldn't understand how we wanted 2 days off for the church picnics. Yeah.
Was there any difference between the teaching and the two?
No, nothing in that way, no.
No. Then when did tourists start coming down here?
Well, now, the tourists here, of course, you tend to remember that because it was generally nice weather and the best part of the year. The tourists up in Cregneash in my young days was this. You'd look out, perhaps in mid-morning, perhaps again mid-afternoon, and that road going up towards the chasms would look like a flower festival with all the different colours of dresses. The road would be full of people walking. They'd walk up from Port St Mary, have a cup of tea at the chasms, and then come down to here. Some of them would go down to the Sound, and the rest would go round back to Port St Mary or Port Erin. That was their holiday, and they enjoyed it, and it did them good.
And Harry Kelly was around till somewhere in the 1930s. Now,
Yes.
Harry Kelly's cottage is one of the big attractions down here now. You'll remember Harry Kelly himself, will you?
Oh, I remember Harry. Yeah, I've been in the house many a time seeing Harry. He had a great old character, Harry. And of course, typical old Manxman, Harry was.
Harry was a Manx speaker, wasn't
Harry was a fluent Manx speaker, the real Manx.
he? Yes.
But the funny thing about it was, there were so many people round here, my mother's generation, you'd hear very little Manx spoken. Now, my mother had a friend coming up from the How. The whole time those two ladies got together, it was all Manx, not a word of English. Yes, it was a Mrs. Krebin, a dear old lady, and it was all Manx, and yet she'd never talk to us in Manx. No, it was disappearing then, and I think the war did a lot pretty well finish it off.
Great stories from Stanley Karran of Cregneash. And there are more, because that's just a part of a long conversation David Callister had with 90-year-old Stanley. And now it's time for another visit to the Little Dark Cupboard, the serialisation of our archive radio play, first broadcast here on Manx Radio 50 years ago, with actors drawn from the island's drama groups of that time. As you listen, you may well recognise some of the voices, and you can see if you're correct when I give you the full cast list at the end of the 8th and final episode. But we're only on episode 6 tonight, and it's all starting to get a bit unpleasant. Husband and wife Bill and Eva, hiking in Dartmoor, have got lost in thick fog and taken refuge in a house after finding the front door conveniently unlocked and the occupants seemingly not at home. Bill's got his hands full. They're not just lost in thick fog. Eva is really on the point of hysteria because she has a terror of feeling overpowered or being in confined spaces, which stems from being accidentally locked in an understairs cupboard whilst she was a small child. But her screams were heard by Smitty, the gardener, who immediately rescued her. Back in the house on Dartmoor, a brief visit from a neighbour reveals that the house is owned by Captain and Mrs. Reethy. And yes, going out for the day and leaving the door unlocked isn't at all unusual. She also mentions that there's a convict on the run, having escaped from Dartmoor prison. But she's confident he'll soon be recaptured, unable to cope with the unforgiving conditions on the moor. Neighbour leaves, and moments later Bill and Eva hear footsteps as a man comes into the room. Surely this is Captain Reethy. But no, unbelievably, it's none other than Smitty. Real name, Smithers. And Eva is delighted to be reunited with her saviour and dear friend of her childhood. Bill, on the other hand, realises quickly that he might be the world's greatest gardener, but he's also the escaped convict on the run from Dartmoor prison. It's down to Smithers to persuade Eva that he's been wrongly convicted of attacking an old lady.
You know I'd never hurt a fly.
Well, I can't think that you would, Smitty.
It was going to London what did it. We should have stopped quiet in the country, Annie and me, where folks are decent and straight. I'll not deny I got into bad company in London. Don't think I'm trying to excuse myself, miss. It's a relief for me to tell you in a way. I've got to admit it, miss. There was times when I took a drop too much. It was the drink made me go with him that night, I reckon. In my sober senses, I never had done such a thing. I never meant to hurt no one, least of all an old woman. I didn't either. I never touched her. Not even when she started yelling. It was them dragged her away from the window and stuffed the scarf in her mouth, not me. But they were lucky and got away. I didn't. I was caught.
You mean you broke into a house? Oh, Smitty, how could you?
I tell you, it was the drink, and I'd just lost another job. I was on my beam ends. Annie was ill. I didn't know which way to turn. And they promised me money, a whole lot of money.
Go on. Tell us about the old woman.
She was caretaker or something. The house was near Richmond. Supposed to be empty, but it wasn't. There was this old woman. And the minute she sees us, she rushes to a window and starts hollering blue murder. They dragged her away and beat her up, and I kept shouting at them to stop. And then we heard footsteps running up the drive. A couple of cops. Well, my pals made off and I tried to, but I fell down the stairs and hit me head. And the next thing I knew, the cops were standing over me and...
Yes?
After that, nothing but bullying and badgering, with Dartmoor at the end of it all. Dartmoor! Oh, my God!
Oh, was it very terrible, Smitty?
Terrible, miss? That's not the word. There is no word. Have you ever thought what prison must be like?
Oh, yes. Yes, often.
Then you can take it from me, it's 100 times worse. The nights I've lain awake feeling I couldn't stick another minute of it, and thinking of the millions of minutes I'd have to stick, and something in me would snap, and I'd start to yell, and the chop in the next cell'd start to yell too, and the others would join in, till the whole place would be in a bellowing uproar. And then the warders would come and...
Oh, please. Oh, don't. Try not to think about it. It won't help.
You must excuse me, miss. I seem to all gone to pieces these days. That's a fact.
Oh, I understand. Now listen. I know what will do you good. A little brandy.
Oh, you're very kind, but... No, I've sworn to myself I'll never touch a drink again, miss. Never. Not after what it led me into.
Oh, just this one, Smitty. As a medicine.
Well, only as a medicine, then.
You made your getaway last evening, I gather. And it's now nearly noon. You had a pretty good run for your money, eh?
Oh, Bill, please!
You knew all along you hadn't an earthly chance. They always get them in the end, always.
Always have done, sir. But it doesn't say they always will. And you never know your luck. And scheming it all out gives you something to think about, see? Something to live for from day to day.
Oh, here you are, Smitty. Drink this.
Well, as you said, Miss Eva, just as a medicine. Best respects if you'll accept them from a convict.
Oh, don't talk like that, Smitty, please. You're not to. I'm thinking of you as you were in the old days. Not as you are now.
They were pretty good, weren't they, miss, those old days? I remember the last glimpse I had of you the day I left your auntie's. You were wearing a white frock with little blue spots.
Yes, I was. Little blue polka dots. Oh, Smitty, how wonderful of you to remember. How wonderful. Come on, do have another drink. Oh, and those darling little boats you used to make for me to sail on the tanks in the glass houses. Oh, I can smell those glass houses now. A hot, damp, jungly smell. How I loved it.
And what about the day I caught you scoffing the peaches you'd been told not to touch? And you begged and prayed of me not to tell your auntie.
And you never said a word. You were a brick, Smitty.
I'd never have split on you, Miss Eva, whatever happened. And the other time, what about that? When I heard you yelling and rushed hell for leather into the house and found you shut up in that little dark cupboard.
That I shall never forget, Smitty. Never. Never as long as I live.
My, but you weren't half in a state, eh? White as a sheet, knuckles all blood and shaking like a leaf.
Well, if it hadn't been for you, I think I'd have died.
You didn't like being trapped and shut in? Any more than I've liked it, Miss Eva, eh?
That little dark cupboard's haunted me ever since, and it always will. I carry it about with me, in my mind.
Well, the one thought in my mind at this particular moment is, do you know if there's a telephone in this house? The best thing we can do is to ring the prison at once and tell him the hunt's up. You're here.
Oh, Bill!
Well, is there a telephone in the house? Will Bill make that call? Is Smithers telling the truth? Join me again next week for the penultimate visit to the little dark cupboard, a radio play first broadcast on Manx Radio 50 years ago, using actors from the island's drama groups of the time. Have you recognised any voices yet? The full cast will be revealed after the final episode. And that's all that we have time for this week. But I'll have more memories from great characters of island life to share with you when we meet at the archive room door at the same time, 5:30, next Thursday evening. But for now, let's turn off the lights and close the door. I'm Judith Lay saying thank you for listening and wishing you a very good evening.